On a gray March morning in 1985, Carol Henderson stood at the front of a yellow school bus parked outside Riverside High School in Alexandria, Virginia, clutching a clipboard and counting heads as 32 sophomore students shuffled aboard with the resigned enthusiasm of teenagers facing a field trip they hadn't chosen. The destination was the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, a standard educational excursion that Carol had chaperoned a dozen times before in her 17 years as a history teacher. She expected nothing more eventful than monitoring bathroom breaks and preventing students from touching exhibits. She had absolutely no reason to believe that a wrong turn and a moment of curiosity would place her and her students directly in the middle of a classified Cold War prisoner exchange, or that the photographs taken by one observant teenager would nearly trigger an international incident that could have derailed years of delicate diplomatic negotiations. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Carol Henderson was 41 years old that spring, a dedicated educator who had spent her entire adult life teaching American history to adolescents who often found the subject less compelling than she did. She had grown up in Washington during the 1950s, the daughter of a State Department analyst who had instilled in her a deep appreciation for the machinery of government and the weight of historical events. Her father had worked on the Marshall Plan, and Carol had inherited his belief that understanding the past was essential to navigating the present. She approached teaching with missionary zeal, convinced that if she could just make history vivid enough, real enough, her students would recognize its relevance to their own lives. The field trip had been planned for months, coordinated with the museum's education department, and approved by the school administration. Carol had prepared a detailed itinerary that would take the students through exhibits on aviation history, space exploration, and the technological competition between the United States and Soviet Union. She saw these trips as opportunities to bring her classroom lessons to life, to show students actual artifacts from the events they studied in textbooks. The Cold War was particularly abstract for her students, a conflict without clear battle lines or dramatic confrontations that they could easily visualize. She hoped that seeing the actual rockets and satellites involved in the space race would help them understand the stakes of the ideological struggle that had defined the past 4 decades. The bus driver that morning was Ray Martinez, a 58-year-old veteran of the Alexandria school system who had been driving these routes for 23 years. Ray was known for his reliability and his encyclopedic knowledge of Washington traffic patterns. He could navigate the complex web of streets around the National Mall with his eyes closed. And Carol had specifically requested him for this trip because she valued his professionalism and calm demeanor. Ray greeted her with his customary nod as she climbed aboard, and they reviewed the route briefly before he pulled out of the school parking lot at exactly 8:15, right on schedule. The students settled into their seats with the usual disorder of teenage social dynamics. Best friends claimed spots together in the back rows. The quieter students gravitated toward the front where Carol sat. A few put on headphones connected to Walkman players, despite Carol's prohibition against personal electronics during educational trips. Most simply stared out the windows or engaged in conversations that had nothing to do with the Smithsonian or American history. Carol recognized this as normal behavior and didn't let it discourage her. She knew from experience that once they actually arrived at the museum and began engaging with the exhibits, many of them would become genuinely interested, despite their current indifference. Among the students was Danny Reeves, a 15-year-old with an unusual passion for photography. Danny carried a 35mm Nikon camera that his grandfather had given him for his birthday, and he took it everywhere, documenting his life with the obsessive dedication of someone who had found their calling. His teachers viewed this hobby with mixed reactions. Some found it distracting, others appreciated his creative eye. Carol fell into the latter category, having learned that Danny's photographs often revealed details that others missed. He had a talent for capturing the significant moment, the revealing expression, the composition that told a story. She had given him permission to bring his camera on the trip, with the understanding that he would take pictures of the exhibits for a class project. On technological innovation during the Cold War, the bus merged onto the George Washington Memorial Parkway, following the familiar route along the Potomac River toward downtown Washington. Traffic was light that morning, and Ray made good time, expertly navigating the curves as Carol ran through her mental checklist of preparations. She had the museum tickets in her bag, the emergency contact list, the first aid kit, permission slips from every student's parents. Everything was in order, everything planned with the meticulous attention to detail that had made her one of the most respected teachers at Riverside High. They were approaching the Roosevelt Bridge when Ray suddenly cursed under his breath, a rare break in his professional composure. Carol looked up from her clipboard to see brake lights flashing ahead, traffic grinding to an unexpected halt on a bridge that was normally clear at this hour. Ray leaned forward, peering through the windshield at the line of stopped vehicles, stretching ahead. "Construction," he said, pointing to orange barriers that had been placed across 2 of the 3 lanes. "This wasn't here yesterday. They must have started overnight. I can sit in this for an hour, or I can take an alternate route through Georgetown. Your call, Miss Henderson." Carol glanced at her watch. They had built some buffer time into the schedule, but an hour delay would throw off their entire morning. "Take the alternate route," she decided. "Just get us there as close to on time as possible." Ray nodded and executed a careful exit from the bridge approach, turning onto a side road that led through the neighborhoods north of Georgetown. Carol had traveled this route countless times in her personal car, knew these streets from her childhood exploring Washington with her father. They wound through residential areas where Embassy Row began, where elegant townhouses flew foreign flags, and security details stood watch at gated entrances. The students pressed their faces to the windows, pointing out the various embassy buildings and trying to identify countries by their flags. Ray navigated with his usual competence, turning left onto a street that should have led them back toward the river and their intended route. But as they rounded a corner, he encountered another unexpected obstacle. Police barriers blocking the intersection ahead, officers in uniform waving traffic away from a section of road that appeared to have been closed without warning. Ray slowed the bus and rolled down his window to speak with one of the officers. "What's going on?" Ray asked. "I need to get these kids to the Smithsonian." The officer, a young man with the crisp bearing of someone recently graduated from the police academy, barely glanced at the bus. "Road's closed, sir. You'll need to detour around Massachusetts Avenue." "How long is it closed?" Ray pressed. This wasn't on any traffic advisory. The officer's expression remained neutral, but Carol noticed a tension in his posture that seemed excessive for routine roadwork. "No information on duration, sir. Please move along. There are other vehicles behind you." Ray closed the window and began executing a 3-point turn on the narrow street, muttering about city planning and lack of coordination. Carol twisted in her seat to look back at the blocked intersection as they drove away. Through the gaps between buildings, she caught a glimpse of what looked like a much larger security presence than a simple road closure would warrant. There were black sedans with diplomatic plates, more police officers than seemed necessary, and what appeared to be men in dark suits wearing earpieces, the unmistakable profile of Secret Service or diplomatic security personnel. Her father's training kicked in. that old instinct he had cultivated for noticing when something significant was happening beneath the surface of ordinary events. She had grown up listening to him analyze political situations, decode diplomatic signals, read meaning into the arrangements of power in Washington. He had taught her that the city's real business often happened in spaces between official announcements, in the coordination of security details, and the closing of streets, and the patterns of movement that indicated something important was unfolding. "Ray," she said suddenly, "pull over for a minute." He gave her a questioning look, but complied, easing the bus to the curb on a quiet residential street lined with bare trees and expensive cars. "What's wrong?" "I'm not sure," Carol admitted. "But did you see all that security back there? That wasn't just road construction. Something's happening." Several students had noticed Carol's unusual behavior and were now paying attention. Danny Reeves leaned forward from his seat, 3 rows back, his camera already in his hands. "Miss Henderson, what kind of security? Like government security?" Carol hesitated, aware that she might be making something out of nothing, seeing intrigue where only routine existed. But the more she thought about what she had glimpsed, the more convinced she became that they had accidentally stumbled near something significant. Her father had taught her to trust these instincts, to recognize when the patterns didn't fit normal operations. "I think so," she said slowly. "Danny, did you happen to take any pictures when we were back there?" Danny shook his head. "No, we were moving too fast. But I can if we go back. What are we looking for?" Carol made a decision that would later be analyzed and questioned by multiple government agencies. "We're not going back," she said. "But if we happen to pass any more unusual security arrangements, Danny, I want you to document what you see. Just take pictures of whatever looks out of place. This might be an opportunity to witness actual current events unfolding." The other students perked up, suddenly interested in what had been a routine field trip. "Miss Henderson, is this like spy stuff?" one girl asked, her voice mixing skepticism with excitement. "I don't know what it is," Carol replied honestly. "But Washington is where these things happen, where history happens. And sometimes you stumble across it when you're not expecting to. So let's keep our eyes open." Ray pulled back into traffic and continued navigating toward Massachusetts Avenue, following the detour route. They had traveled perhaps 6 more blocks when they encountered another police barrier, this one blocking a side street that led toward Dumbarton Oaks Park. The pattern of security was now unmistakable. Someone was creating a corridor, closing off access to a specific area, establishing the kind of controlled zone that suggested either a major diplomatic event or a security operation. Carol asked Ray to drive slowly past the barrier, and Danny raised his camera to the window, snapping several photographs of the police cars and the officers manning the checkpoint. One of the officers noticed the school bus and the teenager with the camera, but made no move to stop them. They were on a public street, not violating any obvious restrictions, just a school bus caught in the general disruption of morning traffic. They turned onto Massachusetts Avenue, and that's when they saw it. About 2 blocks ahead, parked at an angle that blocked the entire intersection, was an array of vehicles that could only be described as a motorcade. There were at least a dozen black sedans with diplomatic plates, several police motorcycles, and what appeared to be a mobile command vehicle with antennas bristling from its roof. Men in dark suits stood at intervals along the street, speaking into radios and scanning the area with the methodical attention of professional security personnel. "Oh my God," whispered Amy Chen, a student who sat near the front and rarely spoke up in class. "Is that the president?" Carol didn't think it was the president. Presidential motorcades were larger, more elaborate, and they didn't stage in random intersections like this. This looked more like the kind of security arrangement her father had once described to her, back when she was in high school and curious about his work. He had told her about prisoner exchanges, about how the Cold War sometimes required delicate operations to swap captured spies, how these events were choreographed with minute precision in locations chosen for their security and discretion. "Ray, stop the bus," Carol said, her voice firm. "Right here. Just pull over to the side." "Miss Henderson," Ray said nervously, "I don't think we're supposed to be here. Those security guys are looking at us." "We're on a public street," Carol replied, though her heart was pounding now. "We have every right to be here." "Everyone stay in your seats. Danny, take pictures. Lots of pictures. Document everything you see." The bus came to a stop about 75 yards from the motorcade. The security personnel had definitely noticed them now. One man was speaking urgently into his radio, while looking directly at the school bus. But no one approached or ordered them to move, perhaps because a bus full of high school students seemed like such an unlikely security threat, or perhaps because whatever was about to happen was so carefully timed that stopping to deal with them would cause more disruption than simply letting them observe from a distance. Carol stood and moved to the front of the bus, where she had a better view. The students crowded toward the windows on one side, all pretending they weren't intensely curious about what was happening. Danny moved to the front as well, his camera clicking steadily as he captured frame after frame of the scene before them. What they witnessed over the next 23 minutes was a precisely choreographed operation that would not be publicly acknowledged for another 3 days. 2 cars pulled up from opposite directions, one approaching from the north with diplomatic plates that Carol recognized as Soviet, the other from the south, bearing no plates at all, but clearly part of an American security convoy. The vehicles stopped perhaps 30 feet apart, their positioning deliberate and exact. Doors opened simultaneously on both cars. From the Soviet vehicle emerged 2 men in heavy coats, one of them in his 50s with gray hair, walking with the stiff posture of someone who had spent considerable time in confinement. From the American car came 3 men, one clearly a prisoner being escorted by 2 handlers. The prisoner was younger, perhaps 35, wearing clothes that looked slightly too large for his frame. The 2 groups walked toward each other with the slow, measured pace of people who understood they were performing a ritual with centuries of precedent. Carol recognized what she was seeing now with absolute certainty. This was an exchange, a swap of captured intelligence officers, the kind of operation that happened quietly in the shadows of the Cold War, acknowledged only after the fact, if at all. "Miss Henderson," Danny Thorne whispered, his camera never stopping. "What are we watching?" "History," Carol replied quietly. "We're watching a prisoner exchange, a spy swap. This is exactly the kind of thing that usually happens in Berlin or Vienna, but they're doing it here, right here in Washington." The 2 groups met in the middle of the space between the cars. There was a brief conversation. Papers were exchanged and inspected, and then the men switched positions. The American prisoner walked toward the Soviet car, while the Soviet prisoner approached the American handlers. The transition took perhaps 3 minutes, executed with the precision of people who had rehearsed every movement. Then both groups returned to their respective vehicles, and within seconds the cars were pulling away in opposite directions, the motorcade dissolving as quickly as it had appeared. Carol stood frozen, processing what they had just witnessed. Danny was still taking pictures, capturing the scene as the security personnel began, removing barriers, and the street slowly returned to normal. She knew without being told that this operation had been classified, that the timing and location had been carefully selected to avoid public attention, and that their accidental presence represented exactly the kind of witness that intelligence agencies worked hard to prevent. Ray broke the silence. "Miss Henderson, I think we should probably get out of here now. Those security guys don't look happy that we saw all that." He was right. One of the men in dark suits was walking purposefully toward the bus, speaking into his radio as he approached. Carol felt a flutter of anxiety, but also a strange sense of exhilaration. They had just witnessed something remarkable, something that would eventually be part of the historical record, even if most Americans never learned the details. The man reached the bus, and Ray opened the door. The man climbed the first 2 steps and stood there, surveying the students with an expression that mixed authority with annoyance. He was in his early 40s, with close-cropped hair and the kind of compact build that suggested military or law enforcement background. "I need to see your identification," he said to Carol, his voice flat and professional. "And I need to know why a school bus is parked at this location at this particular time." Carol produced her driver's license and her school identification badge. "We're on a field trip to the Smithsonian," she explained, keeping her voice steady. "We got detoured because of road construction, and we ended up here. We didn't know this area was restricted." The man examined her identification carefully, then looked at Danny and his camera. "He took photographs," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Carol admitted. "I teach history, and I thought witnessing current events would be educational. We were on a public street. We didn't cross any barriers or enter any restricted areas." The man's expression didn't change. "I'm going to need that camera, and the film inside it." Carol felt her protective instincts kick in. "That camera belongs to the student. It's his personal property. You can't just confiscate it." "Ma'am," the man said, his tone hardening slightly, "what you just witnessed is a classified government operation. Those photographs cannot be made public. I can confiscate the camera and film right now, or you can voluntarily surrender them. Either way, those images cannot leave this location." "What if we promise not to develop them?" Danny interjected from behind Carol, his voice cracking slightly with adolescent nervousness. "What if we just never use the film?" The man looked at Danny for a long moment. "Son, I appreciate the offer, but that's not how this works. I need physical possession of that film. No exceptions, no negotiations." Carol weighed her options. She could refuse, make a scene, insist on their rights as citizens on a public street. But she recognized that antagonizing whoever this man represented would accomplish nothing except delaying the inevitable and possibly frightening her students. Sometimes wisdom meant knowing when to yield. "Danny," she said, turning to face him, "I think you need to give him the camera." "Miss Henderson," Danny protested, his face showing a mix of anger and disappointment. "That's my whole camera, not just the film, my whole camera." "I understand," Carol said gently. "But I don't think we have a choice right now. Sometimes being in the wrong place at the wrong time means making sacrifices." Danny reluctantly handed over his camera to Carol, who passed it to the man in the suit. The man took it, examined it briefly, then popped open the back and exposed the film to light, deliberately destroying whatever images Danny had captured. He then handed the empty camera back to Carol. "I'm exposing the film rather than confiscating it," the man explained, "so that the student gets his camera back. But understand this clearly. What you witnessed here this morning is classified. You are not to discuss it with anyone. Not family, not friends, not the press. If any of you violate this directive, there will be serious legal consequences. Do you understand?" Carol nodded, though she felt a spike of anger at the threat. The students murmured their assent, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. The man produced business cards and handed one to Carol. "If anyone contacts you asking questions about what you saw this morning, you call this number immediately. Say nothing to anyone else. Is that clear?" "It's clear," Carol said, taking the card. "Can we leave now?" "Yes," the man replied. "And for what it's worth, you should probably stick to the original route next time. Detours in Washington can lead to places you're not supposed to see." He stepped off the bus, and Ray closed the door without waiting for further discussion. He pulled back into traffic and drove away from the intersection with more speed than was strictly necessary. The bus was completely silent for perhaps 30 seconds. Then all the students started talking at once, their voices overlapping with questions and exclamations and speculation about what they had just witnessed. Carol turned to face them, raising her hand for quiet. "Listen to me," she said, and her classroom authority cut through the chaos. "I know you're excited. I know you have questions. But we need to take that man's warning seriously. What we just saw was a government operation that we weren't supposed to witness. We need to be very careful about how we handle this." "But Miss Henderson," said Tommy Mitchell, a student who frequently challenged authority, "we were on a public street. They can't actually tell us not to talk about what we saw. That's like a First Amendment violation or something." Carol had been expecting this argument. "The First Amendment protects you from government censorship of your speech," she replied, "but it doesn't protect you from consequences if you compromise national security." That man could have confiscated Danny's camera permanently. He could have detained all of us for questioning. He chose to be relatively lenient. I strongly suggest we accept that leniency and follow his instructions. "But what did we even see?" Amy Chen asked. "Like, what actually happened there?" Carol chose her words carefully. "Based on what I know about Cold War history and intelligence operations, I believe we witnessed a prisoner exchange. The United States and Soviet Union sometimes swap captured intelligence officers. It's not something that happens often, and it's rarely publicized. But it does happen, and what we saw looked exactly like that kind of operation." "So those were like actual spies?" another student asked, voice hushed with amazement. "Probably," Carol said. "Though we may never know their real identities or what they did. That kind of information stays classified for decades." The bus continued toward the Smithsonian, though the atmosphere had changed completely. The students were no longer indifferent adolescents on a boring field trip. They were witnesses to something extraordinary, participants in a moment of history that they would remember for the rest of their lives. Carol felt the same way. She had taught about the Cold War for years, had lectured about espionage and intelligence operations, but she had always done so from the comfortable distance of textbooks and historical analysis. Now she had witnessed it firsthand, seen the mechanics of that shadowy world operating in real time. They arrived at the museum 40 minutes behind schedule, but were still admitted thanks to Carol's prior arrangements. She led the students through the exhibits as planned, discussing aviation history and space exploration. But everyone's attention was divided. They kept circling back to what they had seen that morning, asking questions that Carol couldn't fully answer, speculating about identities and implications. Danny was particularly affected by the loss of his photographs. He borrowed another student's disposable camera to take pictures of the exhibits for his class project. But Carol could see his disappointment. Those images of the prisoner exchange would have been extraordinary, a unique documentation of a classified event. She felt guilty about advising him to surrender the camera, even though she knew it had been the right decision. During lunch in the museum cafeteria, Carol called the school from a payphone and spoke with Principal Davis, explaining what had happened and why they had been delayed. Davis's reaction shifted from irritation about the schedule disruption to concern when Carol described the encounter with the security agent. "Carol," he said carefully, "I think you need to write up a detailed report about this as soon as you get back. And I think I need to notify the school board. This could turn into a significant issue." "I hope not," Carol replied. We didn't do anything wrong. We were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. That may be true, Davis said. But you also witnessed something classified and were explicitly told not to discuss it. That puts the school in a difficult position. What if parents start asking questions? What if the students talk to reporters? Carol hadn't considered that angle. I'll tell the students again not to discuss it with anyone, she said. I'll make it clear that this is serious. Do that, Davis said. And Carol? Maybe next time just stick to the regular route, okay? After the call, Carol gathered the students and reiterated the importance of discretion. She explained that their witness of the morning's events could potentially cause problems not just for themselves, but for the school, for the government operations they had inadvertently observed, and for the people involved in that exchange. She asked them to think about the bigger picture, about how sometimes responsible citizenship meant knowing when to remain silent. Most of the students nodded in understanding. Danny raised his hand. Miss Henderson, can we at least write about it? Like in journals or something? Just for ourselves? Carol considered this. I think that would be okay, she said. Private journals that aren't shared publicly shouldn't be a problem. But nothing that could end up in the school newspaper or on social media or anywhere else where it might spread. The ride back to Alexandria was subdued. The students dozed or talked quietly among themselves. Carol sat in the front seat reviewing the day's events, thinking about the implications of what they had witnessed. She wondered who the prisoners had been, what they had done, what intelligence they had compromised or protected. She wondered if the exchange would ever be publicly acknowledged, or if it would remain one of those secret events that only became known decades later when archives were opened and participants finally spoke. Ray drove carefully, sticking to the main routes and avoiding any detours. Neither of them spoke much during the return trip. When they pulled into the school parking lot at 3:45, Carol thanked him for his professionalism and apologized for the complications the morning had caused. Not your fault, Ray said with a tired smile. Sometimes Washington reminds you that it's not just a city. It's a capital where things happen that regular folks aren't supposed to see. You handled it well, Miss Henderson. Those kids were lucky to have you with them. That evening, Carol sat at her kitchen table writing her report for Principal Davis. She documented everything she could remember: the route they had taken, the road closures, the security presence, the prisoner exchange itself, the confrontation with the man who had confiscated Danny's film. As she wrote, she realized how extraordinary the day had been, how unlikely it was that a random school bus would end up in exactly the wrong place to witness a classified operation. Her phone rang at 8:30. It was Principal Davis. Carol, I've been contacted by someone from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They want to interview you tomorrow morning before school starts. They'll be at my office at 7 o'clock. Can you be there? Carol felt her stomach tighten. Yes, I can be there. Am I in trouble? They didn't say you were in trouble, Davis replied carefully. They just said they needed to verify some information and ensure that protocols were being followed. I think it's probably routine. But Carol, you might want to think about whether you need a lawyer present. Carol spent a restless night, her mind racing through possibilities and potential consequences. She hadn't done anything illegal. She had been on a public street with a group of students. They had observed events that unfolded in front of them without any deliberate intention to spy or interfere. But she also knew that governments didn't always appreciate citizens who stumbled across their classified operations, even accidentally. She arrived at school at 6:45 the next morning. Principal Davis was already in his office, along with two people who introduced themselves as Special Agent Patricia Morrison and Special Agent James Keller from the FBI. Morrison was in her late 30s, with short blonde hair and a crisp, professional demeanor. Keller was older, perhaps 50, with gray temples and the patient expression of someone who had conducted thousands of interviews. They asked Carol to describe in detail everything that had happened the previous day. She walked them through the detour, the road closures, the decision to stop and observe, Danny's photographs, the confrontation with the security agent. The agents listened without interrupting, taking extensive notes. When she finished, Morrison leaned forward slightly. "Miss Henderson, do you understand why what you witnessed yesterday is considered sensitive?" "I believe so," Carol replied. "It was clearly a classified prisoner exchange. The government doesn't want those operations to become public spectacles." "That's correct," Morrison said. "These exchanges are negotiated through diplomatic channels over months or even years. They require extraordinary discretion because publicity can derail the negotiations or endanger the people involved. Your presence there, and particularly the photographs your student took, represented a potential security breach. But the film was exposed," Carol pointed out. "Those images no longer exist." Keller spoke for the first time, his voice gentle. "Miss Henderson, we're not here to threaten you or punish you. We're here to ensure that you understand the seriousness of the situation and to verify that the students involved also understand. We've reviewed your background. Your father was Howard Henderson, who worked on the Marshall Plan, and later at the State Department. You grew up around classified information. We believe you appreciate what's at stake." Carol felt a wave of relief. "I do appreciate it, and I've already instructed my students not to discuss what they saw. I've explained the importance of discretion." Morrison pulled out a folder and opened it. "We've prepared a document that we'd like you and the students to sign. It's essentially a non-disclosure agreement, acknowledging that you witnessed a classified government operation and agreeing not to discuss it publicly. It's a formality, but it establishes a legal framework that makes clear what the consequences would be if information were leaked." Carol read through the document carefully. It was straightforward enough, legally binding her and the students to silence about the events of March 14, 1985. She hesitated before signing, uncomfortable with putting her students under legal obligation. "What happens if one of them talks anyway?" she asked. "They're 15 and 16 years old. They might not fully understand the implications." Keller smiled slightly. "Kids are actually better at keeping secrets than adults give them credit for. But if there were a breach, we would evaluate it based on the circumstances. An offhand comment to a friend would be handled differently than calling a newspaper. We're not trying to terrify teenagers, Miss Henderson. We're just trying to protect an operation that took 18 months to negotiate." Carol signed the document, then made copies for each of her 32 students. That afternoon, she held a special assembly in her classroom, where Morrison and Keller briefly explained the situation and asked each student to sign. Danny Reeves was the most reluctant, still resentful about his destroyed film, but he eventually signed after his parents consulted with a lawyer and confirmed that the agreement was reasonable. The story should have ended there. The students kept quiet, Carol returned to her normal teaching duties, and the prisoner exchange remained unacknowledged. But 3 weeks later, something unexpected happened. Danny Reeves came to Carol's classroom after school carrying a manila envelope with a nervous expression on his face. "Miss Henderson," he said quietly, "I need to show you something." He opened the envelope and pulled out a series of photographs, black and white images that showed the prisoner exchange with remarkable clarity. The diplomatic cars, the security personnel, the two prisoners walking toward each other, the moment of the actual swap. Every detail was captured with professional quality composition and timing. Carol stared at the photographs in shock. "Danny, these were destroyed. I saw that agent expose your film." "He exposed one roll of film," Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I had 2 rolls in my camera bag. I was switching between them to make sure I got good exposures. When he took my camera, there was already exposed film in it. But I still had the second roll in my pocket. The one with all the good shots from the exchange." Carol felt ice water flood through her veins. Danny, do you understand what you have here? These images are documentation of a classified operation. If anyone finds out you have them— No, Danny interrupted. That's why I'm showing you. I don't know what to do with them. Part of me wants to develop them and frame them because they're probably the most important pictures I'll ever take. But I also know they're dangerous to have. Carol sat down heavily in her desk chair, her mind racing through options. They could destroy the film, which would be the safest course. They could turn it over to the FBI, which would fulfill the spirit of their non-disclosure agreement. Or they could do something that Carol knew was reckless, but also historically significant. Danny, she said slowly, I think we need to preserve these images. Not for publication, not to violate any agreements, but for history. Someday, maybe in 20 or 30 years, these photographs will be valuable documentation of how Cold War prisoner exchanges actually happened, but we need to store them safely, and we need to be prepared to never see them developed in our lifetimes. Danny nodded, clearly relieved. That Carol wasn't angry. So what do we do? Carol thought about her father's papers, stored in a secure facility at Georgetown University, where he had lectured in his retirement. She thought about academic archives and historical preservation. We donate them to a research library with instructions that they remain sealed for 50 years. That way they're preserved for future historians, but they can't cause any security problems now. We include a detailed written account of how the photographs were taken and what they document, and we both sign statements acknowledging what we're doing and why. Over the next week, Carol and Danny worked together to prepare the materials. Carol wrote a 15-page account of the field trip, the accidental encounter with the prisoner exchange, and the significance of Danny's photographs. Danny wrote his own statement explaining his decision to preserve the second roll of film. They researched academic archives and eventually selected the National Security Archive at George Washington University, an independent research institution that specialized in Cold War documentation. Carol contacted the archive's director, Dr. Thomas Blanton, and arranged a confidential meeting. She explained the situation carefully, acknowledging the classified nature of the event and the legal agreements they had signed. Blanton listened with intense interest, his historian's instincts recognizing the value of what they were offering. What you're proposing is ethically complicated, Blanton said when Carol finished. You signed non-disclosure agreements, which means you've acknowledged a legal obligation not to discuss this event. By depositing these materials in an archive, even a sealed one, you're creating a record that eventually will become public. Not for 50 years, Carol pointed out. By then, everyone involved in the exchange will likely have either passed away or reached an age where exposure no longer matters. The Cold War will be history, not current events. And these images will be invaluable for understanding how these operations actually worked. Blanton considered this. I can accept the materials under the conditions you specify. Sealed for 50 years from the date of deposit, accessible only to researchers with appropriate security clearances who can demonstrate a legitimate scholarly need. We'll create a finding aid that describes the collection in general terms without revealing specific details. And we'll require anyone who eventually accesses the materials to sign their own non-disclosure agreements preventing publication until after the seal expires. They completed the transfer in April 1985. The photographs, Carol's narrative, and Danny's statement were placed in acid-free archival boxes, cataloged, and stored in a secure vault. Carol and Danny both signed release forms transferring ownership of the materials to the archive while specifying the conditions of access. It was done. The images would be preserved for future historians while remaining hidden from contemporary view. Carol never told anyone else about the surviving photographs, not even Principal Davis. Danny kept the secret as well, though Carol knew it weighed on him. They had technically violated their non-disclosure agreements by preserving evidence of the classified operation, even if that evidence would remain inaccessible for decades. It was a gamble they had taken together, a decision that weighed historical preservation against legal obligation. The prisoner exchange itself was eventually acknowledged by the government 3 months later in a brief press statement that provided minimal details. The Soviet prisoner was identified as Major Mikhail Petrov, a GRU intelligence officer who had been captured while attempting to recruit an American scientist working on stealth technology. The American prisoner was Captain David Chen, an Air Force officer who had been arrested in East Germany on espionage charges that were never fully detailed. The exchange had taken place in Washington as a gesture of mutual convenience, though the exact location was not specified. Carol read the press release with a sense of vindication. She had been right about what she had witnessed. The operation had been exactly what she thought it was, a carefully choreographed swap of captured intelligence officers. She wondered if the delayed acknowledgement had been prompted by rumors or leaked information, or if the government had simply decided that enough time had passed to make a brief announcement without compromising ongoing operations. Her students moved on with their lives. Most of them went to college, graduated, started careers and families. Danny Reeves became a professional photographer, working for newspapers, and eventually teaching at a community college. He never forgot those confiscated images, the most significant photographs he never got to develop. On occasion, when he taught his own students about photojournalism ethics and the responsibilities that come with documentation, he would tell them a carefully edited version of the story, omitting all identifying details and classified information. The lesson was about the power of images, about the responsibility of witnessing, about the complex relationship between truth and timing. Carol continued teaching at Riverside High School for another 12 years before retiring in 1997. She became known for her engaging approach to history, her ability to make the past feel immediate and relevant. Students who took her classes often remarked that she had a gift for helping them understand that history wasn't just something that happened to other people in other times, but rather an ongoing process that they themselves were part of. She never told them about the field trip to the Smithsonian that turned into a front-row seat to a Cold War prisoner exchange. That story remained sealed in her memory and in a vault at George Washington University. In 2008, Carol attended a lecture at the Wilson Center about Cold War prisoner exchanges. The speaker was a former CIA officer who had participated in several such operations during the 1980s. During the question and answer session, someone asked about the Washington Exchange of 1985, the one that had eventually been publicly acknowledged. The speaker smiled and said that exchange had been one of the most complicated he had worked on, partly because an unexpected witness, a school bus full of teenagers, had stumbled across the operation and had to be managed without disrupting the carefully timed sequence of events. Carol felt her heart skip. She wanted to stand up and identify herself, to tell her side of the story, to reveal that she still had the images from that day secured in an archive. But she remained silent, bound by her agreement and by her own sense of what was appropriate. Some stories, she had learned, needed to wait for their proper time. Danny Reeves died in 2015 at the age of 45, a heart attack that took him far too young. Carol attended his funeral and spoke briefly with his widow, who mentioned that Danny had often talked about a set of photographs he had taken as a teenager. Images that he called the most important work he had ever done, even though no one had ever seen them. Carol smiled and nodded, saying only that Danny had been an exceptional photographer with a gift for capturing significant moments. The National Security Archive sent Carol a letter in 2019, informing her that interest in Cold War prisoner exchanges had increased following several high-profile espionage cases involving Russia. Researchers were asking about sealed collections that might contain relevant materials. The archive wanted to confirm that Carol still wished to maintain the 50-year seal on the materials she had deposited. She confirmed that she did. The images would remain sealed until 2035, a full 50 years from the date of the exchange. Carol Henderson is 80 years old now, living in a retirement community in Arlington. She follows current events closely, paying particular attention to stories about intelligence operations and international relations. She watches as new generations of spies and intelligence officers play out the same old games with new technology and new justifications. The Cold War may have ended, but the fundamental dynamics of espionage continue. The theft of secrets, the recruitment of assets, the careful choreography of exchanges when operatives are captured and must be retrieved. She thinks about the photographs locked away in that archive, waiting for their moment of revelation. She wonders if anyone will care about them when they're finally opened. The Cold War recedes further into history with each passing year, becoming as distant and abstract to modern students as World War I had been to her generation. Will those images of a prisoner exchange on a Washington street in 1985 mean anything to people who have never lived through the tension of that era, who have never felt the background radiation of potential nuclear annihilation that colored every aspect of Cold War life? But Carol believes they will matter. She believes that every piece of authentic documentation, every genuine glimpse behind the curtain of classified operations, contributes to the historical record and helps future generations understand their past. Those photographs that Danny Reeves took through the window of a school bus weren't just images of two men walking toward each other on a street. They were documentation of how nations conducted their most sensitive business, of how the machinery of intelligence worked, of how history unfolded in moments that most people never witnessed and would never know about. The field trip to the Smithsonian that turned into an encounter with Cold War espionage taught Carol's students something that no textbook could convey. It taught them that history wasn't just dates and events that happened to other people in other places. It was an ongoing process that unfolded around them constantly, often invisible, but occasionally revealed through accidents and coincidences. It taught them that being aware, being observant, being willing to look carefully at the world around them could lead to insights that more passive observers would miss. It taught them that sometimes being in the wrong place at the wrong time could become being in exactly the right place to witness something extraordinary. And it taught Carol something as well. It reminded her why she had dedicated her life to teaching history. Not because the past was dead and needed to be memorized, but because the past was alive and still shaping the present in ways that required understanding. Every event she taught about, every conflict and negotiation and decision had unfolded in real time for people who didn't know how it would end. The Cold War prisoner exchange she had witnessed was history now, its participants mostly forgotten, its significance diminished by later events. But in that moment on a Washington street in 1985, it had been current events, a delicate operation executed by people who understood that their actions carried weight and consequence. Someday, probably after Carol has passed away, those photographs will emerge from their sealed vault and find their way into books and documentaries about Cold War intelligence operations. Historians will study them, analyze them, use them to understand how these exchanges actually worked. Danny Reeves's name will appear in citations and acknowledgments. Carol Henderson's narrative will be quoted and examined. The story of how a school bus full of teenagers accidentally witnessed and documented a classified prisoner exchange will become part of the permanent historical record. Until then, the images wait in darkness, preserved for a future that will eventually become the present. And Carol waits as well, the last living witness to that extraordinary morning when a wrong turn led to the right place and a routine field trip became a moment that connected her students directly to the hidden machinery of Cold War conflict. She keeps their secret, honors her commitments, and trusts that history, which moves slowly but comprehensively, will eventually reveal what needs to be revealed when the time is right. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.